So now I want to direct your attention to a Twitter poll. It is closed. As far as I know, you cannot participate in it, but we can talk about it. So the poll was posted by Trad Jedi of the Commons, aka Evolving Ego, and he writes, which poses a greater risk to humanity, artificial intelligence or climate change? And the results were 31% artificial intelligence, 69% climate change. Now, this is Twitter. I don't expect anybody to bring their intellectual A game to anything, in the comments. And, myself included, I was particularly lazy. I was just trollish. I said, I picked AI, come at me, bro. And the only person to respond to me was, you're wrong. Wow. Talk about low effort. Anyway, Kurt Harris, MD, writes neither. And Trad Jedi asks, just to clarify, are you saying that neither poses any risk, or is there a third threat you think is even greater? And then Deep Learning, who I followed because of his participation in this thread, who isn't the person who was being asked, but he chimes in, and he's actually making effort. Or if this is low effort for him, then his high effort is going to be really good. He writes, neither seem likely existential risks, both overblown. I'll give climate the nod because it's currently present and likely to have the greater NPV cost. Net present value is what NPV stands for. I didn't know that, had to look it up, and it's an economics term that I just learned it today, so I'm not going to try to, give a seminar on it. So, to me, good answer. Just below that, Dr. Mansakita replies to Evolving Ego. He writes, it's early, so extra points for that. Caveat up front. This is all, just wild speculation at this point, given the amount of information that we have compared to the information we will have in the future. Yay, I like that. He goes on, but I'm surprised it's this close, meaning the poll. Climate change threatens us all. AI slightly threatens the wealthiest nations in minor ways. I'll come back to that. The next one is from Deep Learning. Mike, like most unknowns, this devolves to faith or ideological commitment, if you think that politics isn't faith, or if tribal allegiance isn't faith. It's all faith, I think. But so let's go back. AI slightly threatens the wealthiest nations in minor ways. Okay. I want to bring up a famous quote, which, like most famous quotes, is probably not quite right. Jay Gould is rumored to have said something to the effect of, I can hire half the working class to kill the other half. Sometimes the working class lingo was added later, I think, to sort of politically retcon, to make it applicable to a different set of concerns. I think initially he was talking about he could hire half the Kansas farmers to shoot the other half dead, something like that. But anyway, point being, imagine this. Imagine if the position was, what was Dr. whatever. I think his first name started with M. We'll call him Dr. M. Dr. M says, this is only going to slightly affect a small number of people in rich, and I take him to mean technologically overbuilt countries. Imagine if he said that about banking. That in much of the so-called, well, we used to call it the third world. That lingo doesn't make sense anymore. We'll say underdeveloped nations, poor nations, a great many people, like the vast majority of people in some countries, are unbanked. They don't have bank accounts. Does that mean that the people in those countries are unaffected by decisions made by bankers? Imagine if you held that position, that if you don't have a bank account, then the actions of bankers have no effect on your life. What if AI can hire half the poor people to kill the other half? If you live in a poor country, are you going to be more or less affected by that action? The idea that the only people who would be affected by AI are the ones who are, in contact with large computing systems. Well, you know what? This is not rare. Even in the developing world, even in the global south, most everybody has one of these. Very poor people around the world have these things. These things put them in direct contact with the most advanced AI in the world. So the idea that, AI is only going to affect the wealthiest and most technologically blessed people in the world only slightly is absurd. All the psychological damage and the political, blowback from that psychological damage, or the political knock-on effects from that, from social media, largely comes from algorithms with no conscious agenda, just churning through the space of methodology to find a way to keep users on platform, keep them engaged with Facebook and Twitter and Reddit and YouTube. And it has discovered that a reliable way to do that is to keep us very angry at each other. And particularly on YouTube, a great way to do that is to take somebody whose views are slightly to the left or slightly to the right and coax them, draw them, pull them along to the far fringe. And then when they get to the far fringe, pull them into weird-ass conspiracies on the right mostly, and on the left, pull them into ideological intolerance of even the slightest deviation, from their preferred brand of far left ideology. The algorithms had no intention of creating the social tensions and the social dysfunction that they have. They were just charged with a task, and they weren't given explicit parameters to avoid certain strategies, certain techniques, and so, they just churned through the space of exploring different methodologies, and they went with the one that worked. That's not AI taking over the world. That's not AI emptying your bank account. That's not AI doing anything really explicit. But for somebody who just dismisses AI as a rich person's problem that's only in technological countries, they're just not thinking about the issue, But again, he started off with it's early, so caveat, we're just spitballing here. So props to Dr. M. Let's go down a bit further. Gmork99 writes, anyone who answered AI is deeply confused. Why? He didn't say. So this is simply a bald assertion. It's not meant to be persuasive. He hasn't provided any sort of persuasive, support for the assertion. It's just an assertion. So what's the function? It's coalitional signaling. He is signaling to the people in his tribe, hey, I hold the right beliefs. See, I'm insulting people who hold different beliefs. Extremely low effort, but, if the goal were persuasion, this would be such low effort and so ineffectual as, he shouldn't even have bothered. But if the goal is to demonstrate that he holds the right beliefs and evinces the correct hostility toward the right parties, well done. High return on energy invested here. Good job, Gmork99. Here's another one in favor of climate change, and this is a good one. Kevin writes, now he's got a U.S. flag and a Ukrainian flag, so that tells you a little something about, his position to the current thing. But he writes, the one thing that the Department of Defense has said could be the single greatest threat to the socioeconomics of the planet, climate change. And yeah, the Pentagon has been way out in front in switching to biofuels, deploying alternative energy methods, to keep their infrastructure, their apparatus, their ability, their global strike capacity. They want to keep that intact regardless of, fossil fuel shortages. I'm just reminded of, when I was talking to people about peak oil regularly. And at the time, I was an ex-techno-utopian, and I could still represent the techno-utopian point of view. And, suppose I was in communication, like back in 2009, if I was in telepathic communication with the KMO of 2022, and I could say, yeah, the whole peak oil thing, maybe it'll be an issue in the future. So far, not so much. But these algorithms messing with our minds have got us at each other's throats, and the political knock-on effects have been devastating. If I were to repeat that, Say, here's a little information I have about the year 2022. If I'd repeated that to the peak oil crowd in 2009, I would have been ridiculed, for even thinking that the electric grid would still be operational in 2022. Well, here we are, 2022. I did a throwaway, unscripted series of videos back when I was in Vermont called Peak Oil Bullshit Parts 1 through 5. And people still comment on them. It is weird to me when I get comments on a video from 2, 3, 4 years ago. Who's watching these things? How do they discover them? Anyway, talk about low effort coalitional signaling. The sorts of comments that I get to these things, they're just personal insults, basically. There's no argumentation whatsoever. But I take it that these are people who are either new to the peak oil scene, or they just have, they've committed to it in such a way that there's no dissonance. The failed predictions mean nothing to them. The fact that 2022 looks a heck of a lot more like 2008 than it looks like Mad Max is just, it's not a problem, for their worldview. They're just committed to it. And so, if that sort of dissonance isn't a problem for your worldview, there's no reason to argue, for why you believe what you believe. Just insult somebody who believes something else. But hey, I've been in this peak oil thing for, I've been out of it, I would say, for, I don't know, half a decade. And I was into it for a decade solid. It's just not the biggest concern in my life, and I just don't see that it should be. And sorry, Blue Tribe, I'm really on the same page with climate change. How many times can you live through a 12-year interval where 12 years ago somebody was saying, if we don't fix climate change in the next 12 years, we're all dead? How many times do you have to live through that before you start to question the credibility or the knowledge or the competence of the people saying this, or the agenda of the people making these sorts of claims? You could make the argument, and this is sort of the Fauci argument on masks, that people don't have much use for the truth. We just need them to do what we need them to do. So we're going to tell them what we need them to believe in the moment to do what we need them to do. We wise people have a long-term vision. We understand that, the damage that human society is doing to the climate, the ecosphere, species diversity, that sort of thing, that in 2, 3, 500 years, the results will be devastating, but people won't care if we phrase it like that. We have to say this is going to affect you personally in the near future, and it's going to hit your pocketbook, and it's going to kill you and your children. You'll be lying, baking in the sun, gasping for air in 5 years if you don't send us money. If you believe that humans are short-sighted and stupid and self-centered and unwilling to make sacrifices for the greater good, to plant trees under whose shade they will never rest, then you say what you need to say in the moment. And people have short memories. The memory hole apparatus is well developed, and it just won't matter if in the future your predictions of the future, they didn't come to pass. So, talked about this longer than I meant to. Sorry, buddy, you got to move your pillow. Reading this book just this morning. Here's the cover image. My face, book. The End of Alchemy: Money, Banking, and the Future of the Global Economy by Mervyn King, former governor of the Bank of England. So this is a book, I think, from 2016. Yeah. And in it, this is in the preface, he writes, economists and financial market participants have an exaggerated view of their ability to foresee the future. These are people who get paid to crunch the numbers and to make sober, objective, data-based, long-term forecasts based on their expertise and the wealth of data at their disposal, and, these days with amazing computer modeling. And he goes on to describe how the interest rates of the early 90s through, the early 2000s, a period known as the Great Stability, indicate that the people setting the interest rates at that time had no clue what was coming. If they did, those rates would have been much lower. So, skipping all that explanation, he writes, the difference between earlier expectations and outturns reflects not stupidity, but the impossibility of knowing in advance the scale and nature of the changes that would take place in the world economy and the way that, rightly or wrongly, policy would respond. Which is just an eloquent way of saying predicting the future is hard. If somebody gets it wrong, I don't blame them. I'd say I don't hold it against them, but if they, consistently make failed predictions, then I won't take their future predictions very seriously. But I don't hold it against them personally. What I do hold against them personally is if they are haughty about it, if they're arrogant, and if they are insulting to people who hold different views or have a different vision of the future. That, I think, is weak. That, I think, is... I don't want to be too strong here. It's normal. It's a normal thing to do because it feels good. I would just encourage everyone, including myself, probably most especially myself, to be conscious when we do it. Notice it, nip it in the bud. Or, if it's a fully grown tree like this beauty over here, I'll insert an image here. Well, that tree doesn't need any trimming. That's just gorgeous. Anyway, I'm done. Talk to you later.